Good morning. Welcome to Green Mountain Missionary Baptist Church's morning service. I'm Brian Tier, pastor of Green Mountain Missionary Baptist Church. Thank you for everybody watching these videos and being with us. Be sure and be praying for one another and for our church during this time. I want to say a special thank you to all of our membership and even our guests who have continued to give to the work here. God is continuing to bless and take care of us, and so thankful for that. Thankful for you guys just really doing more than your share really in all of these things, and or maybe doing our share, and also touching base with everybody. I keep hearing about everyone calling everyone else and touching base with them, talking to them, and making sure everybody's okay. Boy, what a blessing to pastor a group of people like you guys that are doing that, and it's a wonderful thing to. Kate tells me that we get checks in the mail and stuff, and people leaving checks and picking up Sunday school quarterlies and all of this kind of stuff. So thankful to be your pastor. Makes me happy. And as I've said in times past, you guys are my joy and my crown, and I love you so much. You just wouldn't even know how much that, or it'd be hard to say how much that I love you. Now you're probably looking and seeing that my hair's a little shorter. Well, because of the quarantine, the governor and other people said that barbershops aren't essential. I beg to differ. They are essential, and I will be visiting one as soon as I have hair enough to go down there and they're back open again, and maybe tipping them a little more than usual. Maybe even paying a little closer attention to how they do it. I start thinking I know how to do it, and Kate says one thing and I say something different. I say just use the razor, and she starts using it, and well, I think at one point she actually says you probably shouldn't do it that way, and I said let me just do it. And so she hands me the razor, and I started in, and she says, well, you got what you got. So I got what I got, and which isn't much, and I guess my hair's been quarantined from me as well. So don't laugh too hard, you might be next. If anybody needs a close shave, just let me know. I can definitely do that haircut. But anyway, I know the people that have cut my hair in the past have always complained that I fall asleep while they're cutting my hair. I always have enjoyed just sitting there and nothing going on, not having to do too much. And I usually do fall asleep in the barber chair. And they ask me what I want or how I want it cut, and I just say keep it short and try to cut as much gray out as possible. Well, I guess I did the same thing, but anyway, I won't be sleeping next time. I'll be paying attention to how to cut it, won't I? All right, Hebrews chapter 11 is where we're going to be today. We're going to be in Hebrews, continuing our study on how to walk by faith, and that's our main goal here, I think, in all of this is not just learning that we need faith or that we need to grow our faith, but what faith can do, how it can change our lives, how it can transform us, how it can actually, we're having faith in a God that we can't see, and that's what the first part's talking about is in Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. We place our faith in a God that we can't see because of the evidence that we can see. And so where do the two things meet? Whenever you're talking about spiritual warfare and you're talking about having a shield of faith and being girt about with truth, all of those, that's all spiritual speaking. But it happens in the physical life. We see these things played out, and this is where we really have difficulty. Is in Ephesians chapter 6. I was doing a little study on that earlier today, and the fact is that it says that we are not fighting against flesh and blood, but against principalities in high places. And so the thing is, though, is that we live in a physical world. But we're placing faith in something spiritual, and we have battles that are going around us that are spiritual, and yet we live in a physical time period. And how do those things intertwine, and how do they make a difference in our life? What differences will they make? And why is it that we have to follow after a God that we can't see? And what's going to take place? Where will He lead us? You know, boy, having that kind of confidence that these guys had to set foot whenever He called Abraham, for instance, and He says, I want you to go to a land that Abraham had never seen, to leave a home and a family behind and say, you've just got to leave and follow after me, and him to follow day after day, year after year, all the way through his life, and then to never see in this life what God had promised to him. Not to see it completely fulfilled. He had seen the startings of it, but he did not see the completion of it. As a matter of fact, it's still being completed and will be completed by the end of time. But brothers and sisters, let me tell you something. What God promises does come to pass, and they have not just ramifications here on this earth, but they have eternal ramifications, us placing our faith, us following after Him. And what it boils down to is that God is trying to use our lives in order to influence the world around us for the cause of Christ. So people will see Jesus in us. And whenever they see Jesus, that they'll want that same thing that we have, that trust that we have in Jesus Christ, so that they will also believe, and so that they can spend eternity in heaven. And this is what it's all about. It's about us doing that to the extent that people can see our good works, but glorify our Father which is in heaven. When they see us following after Christ, then they want to have what we have. They want to have that peace that passes all understanding that we talked about last week. They want to have that grateful attitude, that generous attitude. They want to have that same thing because they don't have it. Apart from Christ, what do they have whenever they go through crisis, when they go through struggles? They have nothing. It's not a learning experience or anything. It's just hard time. And so that's why they get so anxious in it. Okay, well, we have another group of people that we're going to talk about this morning, and that's the Israelites. These are the Israelites after Moses came in there with God's help, of course, to set them free, to exodus them out of Egypt. Okay, so this is the way that it went. And just in case this is the first time that you're watching this or listening to this, so what had happened was God made the promise to Abraham way back there in Genesis chapter 12 that through your seed all the nations of the world would be blessed. And so God did that work through Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob, and then Jacob had 12 boys, and one girl as well, but 12 boys, and those 12 boys made up the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? That was the starting of the country that God had promised to Abraham. But what God had also told Abraham during his lifetime is I'm going to bring all of those tribes down to Egypt for 400 years. They're going to be down there until I bring them up out of Egypt and into Canaan land. Okay, and he says he's going to do that with a mighty hand. And certainly he has done that. With all of the plagues that he brought on Egypt, boy, he has really set them free in a big way. And where we left was that Moses was about to lead them out of Israel, or out of Egypt. And this was again 435 years after Joseph had entered into Egypt that these things took place. And so God had instituted the Passover for them down there in Egypt. He says, during this Passover feast, I want you guys to put on all your clothes, get ready to go. Have your stuff packed, have your bags packed, get ready to go. Because whenever I set you loose, Pharaoh is going to just force you out of Egypt. Okay? And that's exactly what happened, is that whenever the death angel came on Egypt during that Passover time, that first Passover, the death angel came through and he killed every firstborn in Egypt that did not have the blood applied to the doorpost. Now, if you haven't read this, you have to go back and reread this. But what you'll see is that from Pharaoh's firstborn son, all the way down to, it says, the slave behind the mill. Anybody that was a firstborn was slaughtered that night. Okay? And that turned Pharaoh's stomach and all of Egypt as well. They were ready to turn Israel loose. They wanted to push them right on out of there. And that's what God had promised, and God had fulfilled what he had promised. So they had already seen God start working in their lives, and that they could trust in Him for what they needed. All right. So, what we see here in Hebrews chapter 11 is it says, we are in verse 29. It says, by faith they, meaning Israel, passed through the Red Sea by dry land, which the Egyptians, essaying to do, were drowned. All right. And that word "essay" just means they were trying to do it as well. They started going down there through the Red Sea as well. We've probably all heard the story about how that Israel went into the Red Sea and how that God brought them through. Have you ever thought that they did that by faith, that they walked through that sea by faith? As you read the story, it's hard to tell that. Now, we're going to back up here to Exodus here in just a second. Exodus chapter 14 is where we're going to be, so if you want to begin turning there. But we see here that the faith that they exerted here, now the next one we're going to talk about is the walls of Jericho. That's in the next verse. But the first exercise of faith that they had was stepping foot into the Red Sea. Now Israel had been cooped up there in Egypt for all of these 400 years. They were starting to look like Egyptians, smell like Egyptians, worship idols like Egyptians, do all of the things that the Egyptians had done. They were, for the most part, Egyptian. Okay, they had been there for that many years. Just think how old America is right now, over 200 years old. This is twice as long as that. Okay, can you imagine what America would look like in another 200 years? I mean, we don't really even think too much about the fact that we came out of Great Britain at this point in time. Okay, and that's the way that America was started, was through the colonies of Great Britain, as well as France and all the Indians and everything that came as well. But I mean, we read history and that sort of thing. But do you really think about the fact that you came from that kind of thing? Unless you immigrated in the last 50 or 60 or 80 years, you probably don't think about immigration as far as that goes. We think about that we're Americans. We've been here. That's who we are, and that sort of thing. I think that the Israelites kind of had that same sort of feeling, except for when the Pharaoh put the difference between the Egyptians and the Israelites. And he says, I'm not going to let these guys overrun us. And so that's the reason why he put them in the hard bondage. That's the reason why that he was killing all of the male children and everything, is to put that difference back in there, because God wanted them to be separated. He didn't want them to be the same as the Egyptians. He wanted them to serve Him. Okay, but they were now going to have to relearn how to trust in God. They were going to have to relearn all of these things, and so God is going to bring them into a crisis situation that will teach them how to have faith in Him. We right now, and even going through this series here, I feel like that God has us in a little bit of a crisis here in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that I know in some parts and some, depending on what you're having to go through right now, it could be a very terrible thing. But for the most part, we still do have food to eat. We still can go to the store and buy our groceries. And there's some things that we can't do that we're used to doing as Americans that we don't have the freedom to do right now. But there are other things that shows that we still have it pretty good. I mean, if the worst thing that we run out of is toilet paper, then we're in pretty good shape, right? Not that I want to run out or that I want anyone else to. And if you have, then just let me know. We don't want you to go without. But what I'm saying is, if that was the worst thing that happened to us, that would still be a pretty good day, wouldn't it? We'd still have a lot to be thankful for to the Lord. But what this shows us is that we do need to make sure that we are staying faithful to God, that we learn to trust in Him, because there's no assurity. I hope what this has done is it's made us where we're not quite as sure of ourselves and of America as we were before. That we think, you know what, maybe we should trust in God instead of trusting in our government, or trusting in our stores, or trusting in our bank, or trusting in anything else other than God. Because even on our money, we need to go back to the motto, don't we? In God we trust. Not in George Washington do we trust. Not in Washington do we trust. Not in our governor or our leaders do we trust. But we do trust in God. And some trust in chariots and some trust in horsemen, but we trust in the Lord our God. And I hope and pray that that is where you are today. But I want you to know that it's going to take you growing in your faith and going through crisis in times of adversity, that you're going to have to that you are actually able to see what you need to do and how you need to grow in your faith. And I guess that all nations and all times have to go through similar crises. Individuals do, churches do, homes do. Everyone has to go through crisis. And these are the times that try our faith. We've been talking about these men and women who have stepped up in their time of crisis, their time of challenge, and placed their faith in the Lord. And the Lord has always come through for them. And that's what we see with all of these people that we have here in our list, is that God has always come through for them. In some way or another, God has come through. Moses led the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. Could you imagine what that even looked like? Here Moses is, a man that had been tending sheep for 40 years. Now he is going to lead the children of God out of Egypt. And we're talking about millions of people here. We are talking about not just people, but we're talking about older people. We're talking about younger people, babies. We're talking about livestock here. We're talking about herds of sheep and goats and everything else, tents and possessions, everything that they had in Egypt that they were going to bring with them, they're bringing with them. Even the old bones of Joseph were coming with them. This wasn't a fast-moving caravan. This would have been a very slow-paced march as they went. And here Moses is. He's taken off in front of them, leading them out of Egypt. What a beautiful picture that was, him leading them out like this. Exodus 13 tells about this exodus that they were doing. And you can go back and read that. We're going to start in chapter 14 if you want to begin turning there. As much as they had been through with Israel, you would think that maybe God would put a smooth path for them all the way up to Canaan land, right? No, not so. God knew where they had come from. He knew that they had this idolatry in their blood, that they hadn't really been trusting in Him like they should. And so He was going to need to put them through some tests. As a matter of fact, it tells in one part of the Bible that He could have brought them up right through, but He was afraid whenever they faced the Philistines and the Canaanites that they would get scared and turn around and go back. Well, they faced a challenge here, a crisis here that looks like that they're ready to go back as well. But God didn't want them to face battle right off the bat. He wanted them to go through this time of trying and testing to make sure whenever they settled in Canaan that they would be ready to become the nation that God wanted them to be. God brings us through crisis. He brings us through tribulations. He brings us through pestilence. He brings us through famines. He brings us through all of these different things in our lives so that we can inherit the promises that He has for us and actually be ready for them. If God just gave you everything right here and now, you'd be just like that 16-year-old boy that his dad hands him the keys to a brand new Challenger. And he tells him, go out there and have some fun. Okay? Now, a Challenger is a fun car to drive, but at 16 years old, he's going to have that booger wrapped around the tree before you know it. He needs to have a Pinto or whatever the equivalent to that is, a Cobalt or whatever, for a little while, and he needs to have something that he can beat up and bang up for a while, because let me tell you something, if he gives him a Challenger right off the bat, that thing's not going to be worth a plug nickel by the time he gets through with it. He'll have every tire burned off there, even the ones that don't spin. He'll have burned off that car. And so God doesn't just hand us the keys to a brand new Challenger and say, okay, have some fun with it. God brings us through every test and trial that we need to get us ready for that challenge. If you don't believe it, ask Joseph. Remember Joseph, the one that had the coat of many colors? God gave him the promise way back there when he was 17 years old. He was more than 30 years old before he was able to receive the promise that God had given him way back there. Brothers and sisters, these things don't happen overnight. You have to grow into them. Okay, whenever God says that they had the faith to go out into the Red Sea, let's see the crisis they had to go through first. They weren't ready to go through the Red Sea right off the bat. God had to do some training for them, and that's what I want us to see is this training that God put them through and some things that we may need to go through ourselves so that we're ready for God to use us in the capacity that He has for us. Okay, are y'all ready for this? These guys, well, let's go ahead and read a little bit. Chapter 14. Exodus chapter 14. It says, And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they turn and encamp before Pihahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, over against Baal-zephon. Before it, you shall camp by the sea. Okay, so God tells Moses exactly where to take the children of Israel. Now, if you were to look at an ancient map of these places, from what I understand, the way that God had laid this out, so they were traveling, they would have been traveling, let's see. So whenever I get on these videos, I get a little tongue-tied and everything. I can't even keep my direction straight. But they were traveling east out of Egypt, and they were to come up to the Red Sea. God led them to where there were two different cities, these two different places that Moses is given here. One of them was the headquarters for one of Pharaoh's armies, okay, on one side. The other side was the wilderness, and in front of them was the sea. All right, so on three sides you're pretty much pegged in a little bit of a trap, right? A dark alley. Remember those movies that you watch where the guy's running from the bad guy, the good guy's running from the bad guy, and they just run, and then he sees an alley up ahead, and he's going to duck down into it. You know it. You're just watching, you know that he's going to duck into the alley. But what else do you know about that alley whenever he turns into that? You got it right every time. I don't even think it's a 99% thing. I think this is a 100% thing. When they turn into that alley, you know it's going into a dead end, right? And they're going to have to climb a fence. They're going to have to go up a stairway. They're going to have to do something that's just out of the ordinary. Somebody's going to appear out of a door or window to save their life, because if they don't, they're just done for right then, okay? You know that's what's going to happen. Well, God has led Israel down a dark alley. Basically is the long and short of it. And they're face to face with the Red Sea. But you know what? They still can go back, right? Wrong. That's not what it says at all. He says in verse 3, it says, For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are entangled in the land, and the wilderness hath shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he shall follow after them, and I will be honored upon Pharaoh and upon all his hosts, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. And they did so. Verse 5 says, And it was told the king of Egypt that the people fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and all of his servants was turned against the people, and they said, Why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? And he made ready his chariot, and took his people with him, and took 600 chosen chariots of all the chariots of Egypt, and the captains over every one of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued after the children of Israel, and the children of Israel went out with an high hand. And the Egyptians pursued after them. All the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, and all the horsemen and all his army overtook them, encamping by the sea beside Pihahiroth before Baal-zephon. Okay, so now they're closed in on how many sides? All four sides. Okay, they've got a military encampment on one side, Pharaoh to the back, they've got a wilderness to one side, and they've got the Red Sea ahead of them. What do? This is a true crisis, isn't it? This is a situation where you got millions of people, old people, young people, middle-aged people. You got everybody out there. Moses is trying to lead these people, and he's trying to do the best that he can. God said he sent a cloud out there. There's no better telling of where God wants you if he sends a cloud out in front of you and tells you where to go, right? And he's led them to this place where they're entrapped, it seems like, on all four sides. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been in that kind of place? We like to call this what? A pinch. Being in a pinch or a jam. or in a pickle. You ever use those words? I'm in a pickle here. Between a rock and a hard place. Up a wall, up a tree, in a catch-22, in a corner, hard pressed. I believe that about does it, doesn't it? That about sums up where we can get ourselves into, where our lives end up. And when we're in a crisis situation and it seems like all four walls are closing in on us, what do we do now? How can God ever get us out of this situation? In what way, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to scratch and claw and fight our way out? Are we supposed to turn around and beat Pharaoh up when we don't have a military, we don't have an army, we don't have what it takes? Sometimes we don't have the finances that it takes. Sometimes we don't have the health that it takes. Sometimes we don't have the ability that it takes. And it causes us to feel like that we're all encapsulated and we're closed in on every side. And we don't know what to do. Where do we go? Where do we look? Well, brothers and sisters, there's really only one place to look. Actually, there's two. There's up or down. We can look up to God, or we can choose to be like the Israelites and look down, right? That's really what they did. Just happened to think about that, but that's exactly what they did, didn't they? All right, let's look. Verse 10 says, "And when Pharaoh drew nigh, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. And they were," what? "Full of faith, and said, God will get us out of this." That's not what it says. Yet they're listed in Hebrews chapter 11 for their faith. But what does it say first? They were sore afraid. They were sore afraid. Brothers and sisters, faith doesn't get there by no random chance at all. God doesn't just unscrew the screw cap of your head and pour in all of the faith that you need as soon as you're saved. Your faith is going to have to grow. It's going to have to blossom. And there's going to be some times when you are scared to death. You're going to be scared to death. But it's not right. Because the Bible says don't be anxious for anything. Right? Isn't that what we cover there in Philippians chapter 4? Don't be anxious for anything. But I already am. Right? I'm already there, Pastor. Too late for that. Too late to say anything now because I'm already in that fix. I'm already in a pickle. I'm already in a jam. These people were sore afraid, it says, doesn't it? And the children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. They went to the right place, didn't they? Whenever we are anxious, when we're in a fix, when we're in a pickle, we need to cry out to the Lord. But look what they cried out. They said unto Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou not taken us away to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us, to carry us forth out of Egypt? What did they say? Moses, we didn't have any graves back there in Egypt, and you brought us out here to die. They didn't just say that, but look at what else they said. Verse 12. Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? Didn't we tell you just leave us there in Egypt? Because we didn't have any graves back there, right? That's a lie. Wasn't it a lie? Isn't that a lie? Wasn't there some graves back there? Maybe they've forgotten really quickly, and we do have short-term memories when we're afraid, don't we? We forget all the blessings of God, and we forget all the shortcomings of the devil. And that's just a fact. We forget what Satan has done to us. We forget what God has done for us. Was there graves in Egypt? Well, they're talking to a man that his mama had to give him up at 3 months of age, or he would have been killed. Pharaoh was killing off all of the young babies. Had they forgotten that already? Yes, they had, because Satan doesn't bring up all the bad stuff. And let me tell you something, Israel was bad about that, having short-term memories. They loved Egypt after they left it, but whenever they were there, they were crying out to God because of the hard bondage that they were in, and they had told God that they wanted to get out of there. That Moses was the answer to the children of Israel's prayers to get out of there. Okay? God had now delivered them out, and they were in a pinch all of a sudden, and instead of trusting in God, they did cry out to God, but what they cried out to God was, we're going to die. You brought us out here to die. Now, they were telling this to Moses, but what we learn about the servants of God from Samuel, you remember Samuel whenever the children of Israel wanted a king? And you can read in 1 Samuel and see this. But basically what it says is that God told, because Samuel was down in the mouth about it, and God says, they haven't rejected you, Samuel. They've rejected me. We can get mad at our leadership all that we want to, but our leadership is a reflection of who we are as people. Our leadership is a reflection of that. And the children of Israel got exactly the leader that they wanted. But they lost the leader that they had. And that's what often happens whenever we start doing things apart from God, is that we get what we want, but we lose what we had. And we find out that what we had was a lot better than what we lost. So here the children of Israel are in this predicament, and they said, we're going to die out here. You brought us out here to die. And this is what they're telling Moses. And again in verse 12, about halfway through, it says, for it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than we should die in the wilderness. This is the voice of fear speaking of the children of Israel. This is what they were speaking to Moses, is they were speaking out of a voice of fear. Many times when we feel all four walls bearing down on us, when we feel that there's no way out, we start speaking nonsense to God. We forget all of the blessings, the past blessings of God. And they say, don't you know that we're here? And God says, sure I do. Don't you see what I've done? I took 10 plagues and plagued Egypt. Do you think that I brought you out here to die? And that's what we should say, and should be our prayer, is say, God, I know you didn't bring me out here to die. I don't know how you're going to get me out of this fix, but I know you're going to do it, because you didn't do all of that work back there in Egypt just to bring us out here to die. And so I'm thankful to be here right now, and I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm pretty anxious to see it. Because we're not in a place where we can fight Pharaoh. We can't go through the wilderness. We can't go up against the military garrison of Egypt. And so here we are, and here we stand. You led us here. You brought us here. I'm ready to go. Okay? Now, this is basically what God's going to tell Moses, is he's going to say, why'd you stop? Let's keep going. And this is what we need to understand as well, is that God, whenever God brings us to that place, it's not so that we can just not do anything at all. And it's not that our ministry is done. It's not that our lives are done. It's not that we're out of time and out of places and everything. It's just now we can turn it over. We can turn the reins over to God, and we can say, we're here. What next? What's next on the agenda? And God's going to show us. Because this, brothers and sisters, is where our journey really begins. This is where the story really gets good. And we're a part of the story. I like to be a part of God's story because there's always great things that happen. There's great things that happen. It's unbelievable what God can do. Do you know what God's going to do here? Would you be willing to have Pharaoh at your back, the wilderness to your west, to your south, military garrison to your north, and the Red Sea to your front if you knew what was going to happen next? I would. It's one of the things I'm looking forward to when I get to heaven, to see, is this very thing. I can't wait to see what it looked like. What did it look like for the Red Sea to part wide open? What would it look like? You know, as you're walking through there, can you see the fish swimming by? Have all dry ground? We know what's going to happen, so let's go ahead and read. And this is the way that we build faith, because their faith hasn't been seen yet. All we see is fear so far. So how did that fear turn to faith? And that's what we need to see, right? This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where changes can be made. What can we do to get from that voice of fear to a voice of faith? All right, so let's just see. Verse 13, Moses tells them. Now notice Moses is telling them. You remember back a couple of chapters ago, God's having to tell Moses, get over there and lead those children of Israel out. And Moses says, I can't do it, Lord. Now Moses is stepping up on faith, and he says, we can do this. This is the way that it gets done. Brothers and sisters, there's a time for us to be afraid, and then there's a time for us to lead. After we've been through a few crises and situations like this, it's not time for us to have fear. It's not time for us to panic. It's not time for us to be anxious and throw our hands up and wring our hands and everything. It's time for us to lead out and say, hold it now. I've been where you've been. Now it's time to see what God can do. And this is what Moses does. And this is pretty awesome because we're taking what had happened with Moses, and now Moses is swapping feet with it. And this is where Romans chapter 5. And boy, I'm really pushing on time here, but I want to really bear down on this because this is very important, where we talk about how tribulations works patience. Romans chapter 5. Tribulations works patience, patience works hope, and hope gives us experience. And that experience makes us not ashamed. When we're not ashamed of what the Lord can do, then we can speak in those tribulation times. It's not that tribulation never happens again, but whenever it does, we know that God has something working. He has a plan in mind, and so we can be patient. We can wait and say, well, let's just wait and see what God's going to do here. And we have the experience because we've already been through these crises, and then we're not afraid to speak to others and say, hey, look, I've been here. I know what's going to take place. I don't know how God's going to do this, but it's going to be pretty exciting. Okay? Because last time it had to do with the burning bush and a rod that turned into a snake and leprosy and all this kind of stuff. I just can't wait to see what God's going to do this time. All right? And that's the way we need to be able to face them, because God has always gotten us out of these crisis situations. How do we know that? Because I'm standing here right now. And so are you. If you're watching this, you've been through crisis before, and God has got you out. All right? So this is what we do. Moses said unto the people, fear ye not. The first thing that we need to do is put away that fear. Stop having fear, because God is in control. Even in this situation, God is in control. What a great blessing that we have a God that we don't have to fear anymore. What happens, what man can do to us, what crisis can do to us, what anything can do to us. If God is in control, then He's the one that is going to take care of what happens to us. We start living day to day like we're supposed to, and then allow God to do what He needs to do. And so stop fearing. Stop living in fear. Live in confidence. Put those shoulders up. Pull your coat down. Straighten your tie up. You can get out there with confidence, knowing that you serve a true and living God. One of the things that I'm loving about our Sunday school lessons here is giving us this glimpse in Revelation chapter 4 and chapter 5, what some beautiful pictures of what God is doing and how powerful and how awesome that He is. And that He has a plan, and He is going to get us out of every crisis one of these days. And I'm looking forward to that, don't you? And but He's doing it right now as well. I was thinking about this COVID-19 a little bit. Now, I have a little bit of maybe more of a cynical view of all of these things that are going on right now, but let me just say something that slapped me upside the head the other day as I was studying this out and thinking about it, is that whenever they first started coming on with the COVID-19, they said that up to 2.5 million people could die in America. Okay? Now, we're nowhere close to that. I think the last count I had was between 60 and 70,000 people, which is a lot of people still. But it's nowhere around 2.5 million. And what I say, and what I've heard other people say, is those guys were so wrong about it. I can't believe how wrong that they were. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But you know what I do know? Is that what I told our church people, what I told you guys to do, was what? We need to pray about this situation, and that God can help us through this situation, so that it's not as bad as what they're predicting, right? And not only that, but I even heard our president say, we need to be praying about this. We need to have a day of prayer. And I did. I prayed for our nation. I prayed for our leaders. I prayed for that God would remove this crisis and it wouldn't be as bad as what they're saying. And guess what? It's not as bad as what they're saying. Instead of giving credit to the president, instead of giving credit to these guys not knowing what they're talking about, maybe we should give credit to God and say maybe God is the one that spared us from having 2.5 million people die. We're too quick to say, that would have never happened anyway. Well, we're the ones that prayed and said we need to pray about it and that God could take care of it. So instead of being so cynical about things, maybe we need to just give credit where credit's due and say it could have been that bad, but thanks be to God that it hasn't been as bad as what they said. We don't need to live in fear. We need to know that God is trustworthy. And when we pray, He does hear us. He knows what we're going through. And even when we get to the place like these Egyptians were here, or these Israelites were here, where they're praying that, oh man, I can't believe it, that we're going to dig graves out here. Man, if I was God, I would say, get to digging, buddy. But God doesn't do that. What God does is says, I'm going to use this for a lesson right here. I'm going to take you to school. And so Moses is the teacher, and he says, the first thing you guys need to do is stop having fear. Now let's go on here. He doesn't stop there. All right. He says, fear ye not. And the second thing he says is what? Stand still. This is in verse 13. Fear not and stand still. Too many times we're moving about. We move too much. One of the things that Ellie, whenever she watches my videos, she says, Dad, you move around a little bit too much. It's good to have a good critical eye watching what I'm doing, make sure that I try to stand still. It's hard for me to be still, though, when I'm doing this. It doesn't matter if I'm sitting down or standing up. Seems like I got to move around a little bit. But be that as it may, whenever we face a hard time, a critical time, a crisis, instead of moving about, looking for things that we can do, how can we get ourselves out of this mess or whatever, we need to stand still. Be still. Because if we don't, we'll miss what God is trying to do. What was their real options? What's their real world options for the children of Israel at this point? Well, they could fight Pharaoh, which they didn't have a military. They could head off through the wilderness, which would have put them in the wrong direction. They could have, again, tried to fight through the military garrison, or they were going to have buckets there bailing out the Red Sea and seeing if they could get through the Red Sea, build a bridge, or build a boat, and they didn't have time to do any of those things. When you find yourself in a position where there's just really nothing that you can do, stand still. You know, in my own personal mind and heart, whenever these things came up, I kept thinking, what can we do as a church to have services even still, even though all this stuff was going on? And finally, I just had to quit and say, what do we really have to work with here? What can we do? And this is what we can do. And you know what? God has taken and used this medium of service. I would have never guessed it, never thought it, but God did. But it's not from us motoring about trying to move things that we can't move and do things that we can't do. It's about us waiting and seeing. Sometimes we need to just stop and let God do something. So don't fear. Stand still. What else does he say here? Verse 13. And see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will see them again no more forever. He says, stop, or don't fear, stop, and then watch. See where God's working, what God's doing. For me, even in this scenario I just gave to you, I started looking to see what other churches were doing, what other pastors were doing, where God's working, how God was leading them. And I was like, boy, you know what? God has been using this medium for a very long time. I've been a little bit resistant to it. But maybe now it's time for me to see what God can do, not what I can do. I know that I'm not too good on these things. I know that I stutter and stammer and move about a little bit too much, got a little too little hair or whatever that it is, but let's see what God can do, not what Brian can do. It's not time for that. Don't have time for that. All we have time to do is what we can do, and what God has given to us is what he's given to us, and so let's use it for his honor and glory and do the very best that we can do with it. Watch what he can do. He can do a lot more than we can do. And Moses says, these Egyptians that you see here today, you'll never see these guys again forever. Verse 14, the Lord shall fight for you, and you shall what? Hold your peace. Shut it. Let God do it. Let God do the work. This is what faith is all about. This is really what we're learning, is that we do what God leads us to do, no more and no less. You get to that spot, He led you by the cloud, He led you however, with His word, whatever, He's got you to that open door. You go through it and then allow God to do His thing. This is what we're learning this time. This is what we'll learn in the next lesson from Hebrews as well. Is that very same thing. Is that it's just got to be God. We've got to give God time to do what God can do. We do what God, we're responsible for. Whatever God has told us to do, those are the things that we need to be doing. Whenever I say sit still, we're not just sitting on the side of the road watching for the bus. This is doing what you know to do as you're watching. Okay? Stand still. Don't fear. See the salvation of the Lord. Close your mouth. Hold your peace. The Lord said unto Moses, verse 15, wherefore criest thou unto me? Speak thou unto the children of Israel, that they go forward. Just tell them to go. Let's get going here. I didn't tell you to stop. Let's go. Keep one foot in front of the other. Okay? Sometimes that's what it is, isn't it? It's just we come to a dead stop and we're like, I can't go any further. I can't do anything else. And God says, just put one foot in front of the other. And soon you know, you'll be walking right out the door. Little did you know there was even a door there. They didn't even see a door, did they? All they saw was the Red Sea. Okay, so here we go. Was there a door? Well, let's just see. In verse 16 it says, but lift thou up the rod, and stretch out thine hand over the sea, and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, that they shall follow them. And I will get me honor upon Pharaoh, and upon the hosts of his chariots, and upon the horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten me honor upon Pharaoh, upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen. And the angel of God, verse 19, which went before the camp of Israel, removed and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud went before their face and stood behind them, and it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel, and it was a cloud and darkness to them, and it gave light by night to these, so that the one came not near the other all night. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. Brothers and sisters, this is where Hebrews 11, we finally come out to the place where this shows their faith. When Moses told them to do what they were supposed to do, when God did what He was supposed to do, then the Israelites showed their faith by taking a step between those two huge walls of water and bringing all those people and all their possessions into those walls of water. They had to trust that God was not going to close that in on them, that this wasn't some mirage or some mistake. They had to completely put their faith and trust in God that He was going to deliver them to the other side. Now, who did all of the work there? Was it not God the whole time, all the way through, holding the walls up and everything? But what they get credit for was that they put their faith in Him. They trusted God. When there didn't seem like there was going to be a door, God put a door in front of them. All of a sudden, there appeared a place for them to go. Brothers and sisters, it's in crisis times when we are so blind that we can't see what God's doing. And then all of a sudden, when we pray to God, when we stop fearing, when we stand still and we shut our mouth, that God says, oh, did you see that door right there I put in front of you? Just go through it. Just go through it. I'll take care of it. But you know, it takes a certain amount of faith to go twist the knob and open it up. I've always heard that the hardest door that you ever go through is your own. And I think that's true even with crisis situations, is that we get so balled up with fear that we don't want to go through the door. But that's the exact thing that we need to do. We need to follow after God. We need to put our faith in Him. And even when we've been faithless, God is still faithful. He was faithful to these guys. I'm telling you right now, you know it too. And maybe you don't. Maybe you're not like me. But if the Israelites treated me like they treated God, and I was God, they would have been digging graves. But God used this crisis situation for them to learn that they could trust Him. And you know what? If you read their story, their history between what happened there and what we're going to pick up next time with them marching around the walls of Jericho, you'll see that God had to do it over and over and over again. Sometimes they were faithful, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes Moses was faithful, sometimes he wasn't. But God was always faithful, and God did bring them to Canaan land with a mighty hand, just as He had promised. God will deliver you. You need to trust in Him, though. Quit trusting in yourself. Quit trusting in that you're going to be able to make it through. Quit trusting in the critics and the cynics, the doctors, the lawyers, the presidents, the governors, and all this kind of stuff. Quit trusting in all of them. Start trusting in God. He's the only one that can do anything about all of these things, and He already has. It's in my mind and my thoughts now. If anybody asks me, God did this. This is God's work because I prayed for it. And I know that a lot of you did too. That it wouldn't be as bad as it could have been, and it hasn't been. Praise God. Let's thank Him for it. Stop giving credit to these guys not getting it right and start giving the credit to God, who we prayed to that was right, and He always is right. And He'll take care of it one way or the other. Stay faithful to God. Trust Him as you go through your day. And we'll see you next time. I'll be praying for you. You pray for me too. Because you know what? As Moses wasn't faithful sometimes, I'm not faithful sometimes as well. Sometimes I'm not trusting in God like I should either. Pray that I will. I'll pray that you will as well. Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much for this opportunity that we have to study another portion of your word. I thank you for your mercy and your grace. I thank you so much for the example that you give us here with the children of Israel and how you brought them through. I pray that anyone listening under the sound of my voice this morning that's going through challenging times right now, that you would give them the faith to just trust you, to stand still and see what you're doing. And it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen. Thank you.